The morning started like any other Tuesday in Des Moines. I was rushing around my small apartment, trying to find matching socks and gulp down coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, and I almost ignored it. Probably another robocall or my boss asking me to come in early again. But something made me glance at the screen. It was Mrs. Henderson, my grandfather's old neighbor from back home in Cedar Falls County. "Nick, honey, I hope I'm not calling too early." Her familiar voice crackled through the speaker. At 73, Mrs. Henderson had been watching over our family farm since before I was born. She'd been like a grandmother to me after my parents died in that car accident 7 years ago. "Not at all, Mrs. Henderson. Is everything okay?" I asked, tucking the phone between my ear and shoulder as I searched for my car keys. "Well, that's what I'm calling about, dear. There's a big moving truck at your farm right now. Some family from Chicago is unloading furniture and talking about how excited they are to start their new life on their property. I tried to tell them there must be some mistake, but they showed me papers saying they bought the place fair and square." My keys slipped from my fingers and clattered to the floor. "What do you mean they bought it? The farm isn't for sale. Uncle Robert has been managing it for me, but it's still mine. Grandpa left it to me in his will." The silence on the other end stretched for what felt like forever. Finally, Mrs. Henderson spoke again, her voice softer now. "Nick, sweetheart, I think you need to come home. Something's not right here." I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years and drove the 2 hours to Cedar Falls County with my heart pounding the entire way. The Iowa countryside rolled past my windows in a blur of cornfields and red barns, but all I could think about was what Mrs. Henderson had told me. There had to be some kind of mistake. Uncle Robert would never sell the farm without telling me. He was the one who helped me through the paperwork when Grandpa died. He was the one who suggested I focus on my career in the city while he took care of the property. When I finally pulled into the gravel driveway that led to the farmhouse, I felt like I was going to be sick. There was indeed a large moving truck parked near the front porch, and I could see a family of 4 directing movers carrying boxes and furniture into what had been my grandfather's house for 43 years. The wraparound porch where I'd spent countless summer evenings listening to Grandpa's stories was now occupied by strangers arranging their belongings. I parked my Honda Civic next to their minivan and took a deep breath. The man directing the movers was probably in his 40s, wearing a Cubs baseball cap and jeans. His wife was organizing boxes on the porch, while their 2 young kids ran around the yard with a golden retriever. "Excuse me," I called out as I approached them. "I think there's been some kind of mistake. This is my family's farm." The man looked up from the box he was carrying and smiled politely. "I'm sorry, but you must be confused. We just bought this place. Closed on it last week. I'm Tom Bradley, and this is my wife, Susan." He gestured toward the woman on the porch, who waved uncertainly. "I'm Nick Peterson," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "My grandfather, Henry Peterson, owned this farm. He passed away 7 years ago and left it to me in his will. My uncle Robert has been managing it, but it's not for sale." Tom's expression grew more serious. He set down the box and pulled out his phone. "Let me call our realtor. This is really strange. We bought this property from a Robert Peterson. He said he was the owner and showed us all the proper documentation." My stomach dropped. "Robert Peterson, my uncle." "That's my uncle," I whispered more to myself than to Tom. "But he's not the owner. I am." Susan Bradley approached us, looking concerned. "Kids, go play in the backyard for a few minutes," she told their children. Then she turned to me. "We've been looking for a place like this for 2 years. We sold our house in Chicago and used all our savings. If there's really a problem with the title, I need to see the paperwork," I said, my voice stronger now. "I need to see what my uncle told you." Tom disappeared into the house and returned with a folder full of documents. As I flipped through them, I saw my uncle's signature on multiple pages, along with official-looking seals and stamps. But what made my blood run cold was seeing the property described as belonging to Robert Peterson, sole owner. There was no mention of my grandfather's will or my inheritance. "This is fraud," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "My uncle committed fraud." The Bradleys exchanged worried glances. "Look, we're really sorry about this," Tom said. "But we bought this place in good faith. We have our own papers, our own mortgage. We can't just pack up and leave." I understood their position, but I also knew I couldn't let this stand. This farm wasn't just property to me. It was my connection to my grandfather, my family history, and the only thing I had left of my childhood. Every summer I'd spent here. Every lesson Grandpa had taught me about the land, every memory I'd made in these fields was part of who I was. "I need to call my uncle," I said, pulling out my phone with shaking hands. There has to be an explanation. But as I dialed Robert's number, I realized I hadn't heard from him in over 3 months. The last time we'd spoken, he'd mentioned something about wanting to downsize his own property and maybe moving to Florida. I'd thought he was just talking about his house in town, not about selling my farm to fund his retirement. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. "Uncle Robert, it's Nick. I'm at the farm right now, and there's a family here who says they bought it from you. I need you to call me back immediately. There's obviously been some kind of mistake." But even as I left the message, I knew in my heart that this wasn't a mistake. This was betrayal on a level I'd never imagined possible. The man who had helped raise me after my parents died, who had promised to take care of my inheritance, had stolen everything from me. Uncle Robert never called back. After leaving 3 more increasingly desperate voicemails, I realized he was avoiding me. The Bradleys had been incredibly understanding, even offering to let me stay in the farmhouse guest room while I figured things out. But I couldn't impose on people who were dealing with their own crisis because of my uncle's actions. Instead, I drove to the Sunset Motel on the outskirts of town, a place that hadn't been updated since the 1980s but had clean rooms and free coffee. As I sat on the scratchy bedspread, staring at the wood-paneled walls, I tried to piece together how this could have happened. How had my uncle managed to sell property that wasn't his? How had he convinced everyone that he was the rightful owner? The next morning, I drove to the Cedar Falls County Courthouse, a red brick building that had stood in the center of town for over a century. The clerk at the records office was a woman named Dorothy who remembered my grandfather fondly. She had salt and pepper hair pulled back in a neat bun and wore reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck. "Nick Peterson," she said with a warm smile. "I haven't seen you since your grandfather's funeral. How are you holding up, dear?" "I've been better, Mrs. Walsh. I need to look at the property records for my family's farm. There's been some kind of problem with the title." Her expression grew serious as she led me to a computer terminal. "What kind of problem?" I explained the situation while she pulled up the records. As the documents appeared on the screen, I watched her face change from confusion to concern to outright alarm. "This doesn't make sense," she said, adjusting her glasses. "According to what's filed here, your Uncle Robert became the sole owner of the property 3 months ago through something called a quiet title action. It says here that he claimed the property had been abandoned and that he was the rightful heir." "But that's impossible," I said, leaning closer to the screen. "The farm wasn't abandoned. He was managing it for me, and I'm the rightful heir, not him. I have my grandfather's will." Mrs. Walsh printed out several pages of documents. "This is very strange, Nick. A quiet title action is typically used when there's a dispute about ownership or when property has been abandoned for years. But your grandfather's will clearly states that the farm goes to you." I remember processing those documents myself. I stared at the papers in my hands, trying to make sense of the legal language. How is this possible? How can someone just claim property that belongs to someone else? "Well, there are procedures in place to prevent this kind of thing," she said, her voice growing more concerned. "But if no one contests the quiet title action within the specified time period, it can go through. Did you receive any legal notices about this?" I shook my head. "Nothing. I would have remembered something like that. That's very troubling. You should have received multiple notices by mail. Let me check what address they have on file for you." She typed something into the computer and frowned. "The notices were sent to your uncle's address, not yours. It says here that you designated him as your representative for all matters concerning the property." "I never designated him as anything," I said, feeling anger building in my chest. "I mean, yes, he was helping me manage the farm, but I never signed anything giving him legal authority to represent me." Mrs. Walsh looked at me with sympathy. "Nick, I think you need to talk to a lawyer. This looks like fraud to me, but proving it won't be easy. Your uncle has covered his tracks pretty well." I left the courthouse feeling overwhelmed and betrayed. How long had Uncle Robert been planning this? Had he been working toward stealing my farm from the moment my grandfather died? The thought made me sick to my stomach. I decided to drive by my uncle's house on Maple Street, the same house where I'd spent countless weekends as a child. The driveway was empty, and when I knocked on the door, there was no answer. Mrs. Kowalski, the neighbor, was watering her garden and called out to me. "If you're looking for Robert, he's not there," she said, walking over to the fence that separated their properties. "He left for Florida about 2 weeks ago. Said he was retiring and bought himself a condo down there." "Did he say when he'd be back?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Oh, honey, I don't think he's coming back. He had a big estate sale and sold most of his furniture. Even sold his truck to the Miller boy down the street. Seemed like he was in quite a hurry to get out of town. My uncle had taken the money from selling my farm and fled to Florida." The betrayal cut deeper than I'd thought possible. This wasn't just about property or money. This was about family, about trust, about the man who had looked me in the eye at my grandfather's funeral and promised to take care of everything. I drove to the town's only coffee shop, a place called The Grind that had opened a few years ago in what used to be the old hardware store. I needed to think, to plan, to figure out what to do next. The owner, a woman named Lisa who had gone to high school with my cousin, brought me a coffee, and asked if I was okay. "Just dealing with some family stuff," I said, not ready to explain the whole situation to someone I barely knew. "Well, if you need anything, you just let me know. This town takes care of its own." That afternoon, I called my college roommate Sarah, who now worked as a paralegal in Minneapolis. Sarah had always been the practical one, the one who knew how to handle difficult situations. When I explained what had happened, she was quiet for a long moment. "Nick, this is serious. Your uncle basically stole your property using the legal system. But the good news is that if you can prove fraud, you might be able to get it back. You need to find a lawyer who specializes in property law, and you need to do it fast." "I don't know any lawyers," I said, "and I don't know if I can afford one." "Let me make some calls," Sarah said. "I know some people who might be able to help. And don't worry about the money right now. If you have a strong case, a lot of lawyers will work on contingency, meaning they only get paid if you win." That evening, I sat in my motel room with copies of all the documents I'd gathered, trying to understand how my uncle had managed to pull this off. The quiet title action, the forged designation of representative, the notices sent to the wrong address. It was all carefully orchestrated. But Mrs. Walsh was right. Proving fraud wouldn't be easy. I thought about my grandfather and all the stories he'd told me about the farm, how his own grandfather had bought the land in 1923, how the family had survived the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression, how each generation had worked to improve the property and pass it on to the next. This wasn't just my inheritance, it was my family's legacy, and I wasn't going to let Uncle Robert steal it without a fight. The next morning, Sarah called back with good news. "I found you a lawyer," she said. "His name is James Martinez, and he's young, but he's supposed to be really good with property disputes. He's willing to meet with you today if you can get to his office in Cedar Rapids." As I drove toward Cedar Rapids, I felt a mixture of hope and determination. I didn't know what this lawyer would tell me, but I knew I had to try. The farm wasn't just property to me. It was home. It was family. It was everything my grandfather had worked for. And I wasn't going to let Uncle Robert's betrayal be the end of the story. James Martinez's office was in a converted Victorian house on the outskirts of Cedar Rapids, with a sign that read, "Martinez and Associates," in modest gold lettering. I'd expected a big law firm with marble floors and intimidating secretaries, but this felt more like visiting someone's home. The receptionist, a friendly woman named Maria, offered me coffee and told me that James would be with me shortly. When James emerged from his office, I was surprised by how young he looked. He couldn't have been more than 30, with dark hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a simple button-down shirt and khakis, not the expensive suit I'd imagined. "Ms. Peterson? I'm James Martinez. Sarah Chen spoke very highly of you when she called." His handshake was firm and confident. "Please, come into my office and tell me what's going on." I spent the next hour explaining everything. My grandfather's will, my uncle's management of the farm, the shocking discovery at the property, and what I'd learned at the courthouse. James listened carefully, taking notes and asking detailed questions about dates, documents, and timelines. "This is definitely fraud," he said when I finished. "Your uncle used the quiet title process illegally, and he clearly forged documents to make himself appear to be your legal representative. The question is whether we can prove it in court and whether we can get your property back." "What are our chances?" I asked, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. James leaned back in his chair, considering. "The good news is that we have your grandfather's original will, which clearly states that you inherited the property. The bad news is that your uncle has legal documents showing he went through the proper channels to claim the property. We'll need to prove that those documents are fraudulent. How do we do that? We'll need to examine the signatures on the documents your uncle filed. We'll need to find witnesses who can testify that you never gave him authority to represent you. And we'll need to prove that the notices about the quiet title action were deliberately sent to the wrong address to prevent you from contesting it." Over the next few days, James and I worked together to build our case. He connected me with a handwriting expert named Dr. Patricia Williams, who examined the signature on the document that supposedly designated my uncle as my representative. After 2 hours of careful analysis, she confirmed what we suspected. "This signature is definitely forged," Dr. Williams said, showing us the comparison under a magnifying glass. "The pressure points are wrong, the letter formation is inconsistent, and there are several telltale signs of someone trying to copy another person's handwriting." We also tracked down the notary public who had supposedly witnessed my signature on the document. When James called him, the man was confused and concerned. "I never notarized anything for Nick Peterson," he said. "I don't even know who that is. If my seal is on a document I didn't notarize, then someone stole it or forged it." The evidence was building, but James warned me that we still had a long fight ahead. "Your uncle sold the property to innocent buyers who acted in good faith. Even if we prove fraud, getting the property back won't be simple. The Bradleys have rights too. and they're not going to want to give up their new home. This was the part that kept me awake at night. I genuinely liked Tom and Susan Bradley, and I felt terrible that they were caught in the middle of my family's mess. They'd used their life savings to buy what they thought was their dream home, and now they were facing the possibility of losing everything because of my uncle's crimes. I decided to drive back to the farm and talk to them directly. I found Tom in the barn, working on setting up a workshop area. He looked up when I entered, and I could see the stress in his eyes. "Any news?" he asked, setting down his tools. "My lawyer says we have a strong case that my uncle committed fraud," I said. "But I want you to know that I'm not trying to hurt you and your family. You didn't do anything wrong." Tom nodded, his expression grim. "We appreciate that, Nick, but we're in a tough spot here. We sold our house in Chicago. We can't get it back, and we don't have anywhere else to go." "I know," I said, "and I'm hoping we can find a solution that works for everyone." "What kind of solution?" I'd been thinking about this constantly. "Well, if we can prove that my uncle defrauded all of us, maybe we can go after him for damages. Maybe we can make him pay you back what you lost, and you can find another property. Or maybe we can work out some kind of arrangement where you can stay here while we sort everything out." Tom looked at me with surprise. "You'd do that? Even though this is your family's farm? This situation isn't your fault," I said. "And throwing you and your family out on the street isn't going to solve anything. We're all victims of my uncle's greed." That weekend, Sarah drove down from Minneapolis to help me search through my grandfather's papers. We spent hours in the farmhouse attic, going through boxes of documents that the Bradleys had kindly allowed us to examine. Most of it was routine farm business, receipts, tax records, insurance papers. But then Sarah found something that made both of us gasp. "Nick, look at this," she said, holding up a faded manila envelope. "It's marked important legal documents in your grandfather's handwriting." Inside the envelope were the original copies of my grandfather's will, along with a deed to the property that dated back to 1923. But what caught my attention was a letter addressed to me in my grandfather's familiar handwriting. "My dear Nick," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I hope that you are taking good care of our family farm. I want you to know that this land has been in our family for 4 generations, and I trust you to keep it in the family for generations to come. But I also want you to be careful. Your Uncle Robert has always been jealous of what our family has built here, and I worry that he might try to take advantage of you after I'm gone. If he ever causes you trouble, remember that you have allies in this community who will help you fight for what's rightfully yours." I had to stop reading because my eyes were filling with tears. Even from beyond the grave, my grandfather was trying to protect me and warn me about what Uncle Robert might do. "This is incredible," Sarah said, reading over my shoulder. "Your grandfather suspected that your uncle might try something like this. But why didn't he do something about it when he was alive?" I asked. "Maybe he hoped he was wrong," Sarah said. "Or maybe he thought that by leaving you the property clearly in his will, he'd prevented any problems." We made copies of everything and brought them to James the next day. He was especially interested in the original deed and my grandfather's letter. "This helps establish motive," he said. "If your grandfather was worried about your uncle's intentions, it suggests that this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime. Your uncle may have been planning this for years." James also had news about Uncle Robert. "I hired a private investigator to track him down in Florida. He's living in a condo in St. Petersburg that he paid for in cash. He's also been spending money pretty freely. New car, expensive dinners, trips to the casino. It looks like he's enjoying the profits from selling your farm." The anger I felt was overwhelming. While I was struggling to pay for a lawyer and living in a cheap motel, Uncle Robert was living it up in Florida with money that rightfully belonged to me. But James told me that his spending habits might actually help our case. If we can show that he used the proceeds from the fraudulent sale to fund his lifestyle, it strengthens our argument that this was a deliberate crime, not a misunderstanding, he said. As we prepared for court, I realized that this fight wasn't just about getting my property back. It was about standing up for what was right, about honoring my grandfather's memory, and about proving that people like Uncle Robert couldn't just take whatever they wanted from those who trusted them. The farm represented everything my family had worked for, and I wasn't going to let it go without a fight. 2 weeks before our court date, James received a call that changed everything. Uncle Robert's lawyer in Florida had reached out, claiming that my uncle was willing to negotiate a settlement. I felt a mix of relief and anger. Relief that we might avoid a lengthy court battle, but anger that he was only willing to talk now that he'd been caught. "He's offering to pay you $50,000 to drop the case," James told me over the phone. "His lawyer says it's a generous offer considering the legal costs you'll face if this goes to trial." $50,000? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The farm is worth at least $400,000. He's offering me barely more than 10% of what he stole from me. "I know it's insulting," James said, But his lawyer is also threatening to drag this out for years with appeals and countersuits. They're trying to wear you down. I thought about it for exactly 30 seconds. No deal. I want my farm back, and I want him to face consequences for what he did. If he wanted to negotiate, he should have thought about that before he committed fraud. James sounded proud when he responded. I was hoping you'd say that. I think we have a strong case, and I don't think you should settle for pennies on the dollar. But Uncle Robert's lawyer wasn't finished. A few days later, I received a certified letter at my motel. Inside was a handwritten note from my uncle, the first direct communication I'd had from him since this whole nightmare began. Nick, the letter read, I know you're upset, but you need to understand that I did what I had to do. Your grandfather left me to manage that farm, and it was falling apart. The roof needed repairs, the fences were broken, and the property taxes were eating up any income. I put my own money into keeping it going for years. Money I'll never get back. When I saw a chance to get some of that money back and secure my retirement, I took it. I never meant to hurt you, but you were living your life in the city and didn't seem to care about the farm anyway. Maybe it's time to accept that some things change and move on with your life. I was so angry after reading the letter that I had to take a walk around the motel parking lot to calm down. How dare he try to justify what he'd done? How dare he act like he was doing me a favor by stealing my inheritance? And the claim that I didn't care about the farm was the most hurtful part of all. I called Sarah immediately. He's trying to make me feel guilty, I told her after reading the letter aloud. He's acting like I abandoned the farm and he was just cleaning up my mess. That's exactly what guilty people do, Sarah said. They try to shift the blame to their victims. Don't let him get in your head, Nick. You trusted him to take care of something that belonged to you, and he betrayed that trust. The next morning, I drove to the farm to talk to Mrs. Henderson. I found her in her garden, tending to her tomatoes with the same care she'd shown for the past 40 years. When she saw me coming, she set down her watering can and invited me to sit on her porch. I heard about what Robert did, she said without preamble. I want you to know that not everyone in this town is buying his story. What story is he telling? Well, his lawyer has been calling people around here, trying to find witnesses who'll say that you abandoned the property and that Robert was just trying to save it. But most folks remember how much you loved this place when you were little, and they know Robert was always jealous of what your grandfather built here. Mrs. Henderson poured me a glass of lemonade from the pitcher she kept on her porch table. I want to testify for you, Nick. I saw how Robert changed after your grandfather died. He started acting like he owned the place, making decisions without consulting you, talking about how the property needed someone who really understood farming. Would you really be willing to testify? Honey, I've lived next to this farm for 43 years. I watched your grandfather build it from nothing, and I watched you grow up here. What Robert did is wrong, and I'm going to help you fight it. Over the next few days, James and I worked on preparing for trial. We interviewed neighbors, gathered financial records, and organized all of our evidence. The handwriting expert confirmed that several documents had been forged, and we had testimony from the notary public that his seal had been used without his knowledge. But the most important discovery came when James's private investigator found records of Uncle Robert's gambling debts. Apparently, he owed money to several casinos in Iowa and Illinois, and he'd been struggling financially for years before he sold the farm. This explains the motive, James said as we reviewed the investigator's report. Your uncle wasn't just greedy, he was desperate. He needed money to pay off his gambling debts, and he saw your farm as an easy target. 3 days before the trial, Tom Bradley approached me while I was visiting the farm. He looked uncomfortable but determined. Nick, I want you to know that Susan and I have been talking and we've decided something. If you win this case and get the farm back, we're not going to fight you on it. I was surprised. What do you mean? I mean we're going to pack up and leave. We'll figure something out. This is your family's land, and what your uncle did was wrong. We don't want to be part of keeping you from what's rightfully yours. Tom, you don't have to do that. We can work something out. He shook his head. No, we've made up our minds. But we do have one request. If you get the farm back, would you consider selling it to us at a fair price? We really do love this place, and we'd take good care of it. I thought about his offer. If I win, and if we can go after my uncle for damages to pay you back what you lost, then yes, I'd consider it. But I want to make sure you're not getting hurt by his crimes. The night before the trial, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my grandfather and all the conversations we'd had about the farm. I remembered him telling me that the land was more than just property. It was a legacy, a connection to the past, and a responsibility to the future. I also thought about Uncle Robert and how he'd betrayed not just me, but the memory of my grandfather and the trust of our entire family. He'd taken something that represented generations of hard work and sacrifice, and he'd sold it to pay his gambling debts. James called me early the next morning. Are you ready for this? He asked. As ready as I'll ever be, I said, though my stomach was churning with nerves. Remember, we have a strong case. We have proof of fraud, we have witnesses, and we have your grandfather's original will. Your uncle's lawyer is going to try to make you look like an ungrateful niece who abandoned her responsibilities, but we're going to show the judge exactly what kind of man Robert Peterson really is. As I got dressed for court, I thought about my grandfather's letter and his warning about Uncle Robert. He'd been right to be worried, but he'd also been right to trust me to fight for what was mine. Today, I was going to honor his memory and prove that some things are worth fighting for, no matter how difficult the battle might be. The drive to the courthouse felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. But as I pulled into the parking lot and saw James waiting for me with his briefcase and confident smile, I felt a surge of determination. This was my chance to get justice, to reclaim my family's legacy, and to show Uncle Robert that he'd underestimated the granddaughter of Henry Peterson. The Cedar Falls County Courthouse had never felt so imposing as it did that Tuesday morning. I sat next to James at the plaintiff's table, trying to calm my nerves as people filed into the courtroom. Mrs. Henderson was there, along with several other neighbors who had come to support me. Tom and Susan Bradley sat in the back, looking as nervous as I felt. And then I saw him, Uncle Robert, sitting at the defendant's table next to his lawyer, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. It had been months since I'd seen him in person, and he looked older, more tired. His hair had gone completely gray, and he'd lost weight. For just a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy for the man who had once taken me fishing and taught me how to drive his old pickup truck. But then I remembered why we were here, and my resolve hardened. Judge Patricia Coleman was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind but sharp eyes. She'd been on the bench for over 20 years. And James had told me she had a reputation for fairness and no tolerance for fraud. "This court is now in session," she announced. "We're here today to hear the case of Peterson versus Peterson regarding ownership of a 200-acre farm property in Cedar Falls County. Mr. Martinez, you may present your opening statement." James stood up and addressed the court with confidence. "Your Honor, this case is about fraud, pure and simple. The defendant, Robert Peterson, used forged documents and illegal procedures to steal property that rightfully belongs to his niece, the plaintiff Nicole Peterson. We will show that Mr. Robert Peterson deliberately deceived the court system, forged his niece's signature, and filed false claims in order to steal her inheritance and sell it for his own financial gain. Uncle Robert's lawyer, a thin man named David Walsh, countered with his own version of events. Your Honor, my client acted in good faith to preserve a property that was being neglected and falling into disrepair. Ms. Peterson had abandoned her responsibilities as a property owner, and Mr. Peterson stepped in to prevent the farm from becoming a burden on the community. The first witness James called was Mrs. Henderson. She walked to the witness stand with dignity, wearing her best dress and the pearl necklace she saved for special occasions. Under James's questioning, she testified about how much I had loved the farm as a child and how Uncle Robert had changed after my grandfather's death. Robert started acting like he owned the place, she said clearly. He stopped consulting Nick about decisions, and he started talking about how the property needed someone who really understood farming. But that farm had been in Nick's family for generations, and she had every right to make her own decisions about it. Uncle Robert's lawyer tried to challenge her testimony during cross-examination. Mrs. Henderson, isn't it true that Ms. Peterson rarely visited the farm after her grandfather's death? She visited when she could, Mrs. Henderson replied firmly. She was building a career and trying to make a life for herself, just like her grandfather would have wanted. That doesn't mean she abandoned the farm. Next, James called Dr. Patricia Williams, our handwriting expert. She presented her analysis of the forged documents with scientific precision, showing the judge enlarged photographs that clearly demonstrated the differences between my real signature and the forgery Uncle Robert had used. In my professional opinion, Dr. Williams testified, these signatures were definitely forged. The pressure patterns, letter formation, and pen strokes are all consistent with someone attempting to copy another person's handwriting. When the notary public testified that his seal had been used without his knowledge, I saw Uncle Robert shift uncomfortably in his chair. The evidence was building, and it was becoming clear that he had orchestrated an elaborate fraud. But the most powerful moment came when James read my grandfather's letter aloud in court. As he spoke my grandfather's words about trusting me to keep the farm in the family and warning about Uncle Robert's jealousy, I saw several people in the courtroom wipe their eyes. Even Judge Coleman seemed moved by the letter. When it was time for Uncle Robert's lawyer to present his defense, he called Uncle Robert to the witness stand. As my uncle was sworn in, I noticed his hands were shaking. He looked older and more frail than I remembered, but I reminded myself that he had chosen this path. Mr. Peterson, his lawyer began, Please tell the court about your relationship with the farm and your decision to claim ownership. Uncle Robert's voice was barely above a whisper as he began to speak. I helped my father-in-law Henry run that farm for over 15 years. When he died, Nick was just a kid, trying to figure out her life in the city. The farm needed constant attention. Repairs, maintenance, paying the taxes. I put my own money into it, thousands of dollars over the years. And did Ms. Peterson contribute to these expenses? No, she didn't. She was focused on her career, which I understood, but the farm couldn't wait for her to decide what she wanted to do with it. James rose for cross-examination, and I could see the determination in his eyes. Mr. Peterson, did you ever ask your niece to contribute to the farm's expenses? Uncle Robert hesitated. Well, no, but did you ever provide her with receipts or documentation showing what you spent? I didn't think it was necessary. She knew I was taking care of things. Mr. Peterson, did you or did you not forge your niece's signature on legal documents? Uncle Robert's lawyer objected, but Judge Coleman allowed the question. Uncle Robert sat in silence for a long moment, his face growing red. I may have signed her name, but it was only to protect the property. She would have agreed if I'd asked. But you didn't ask, did you? Instead, you forged her signature, lied to the court about having her permission to represent her, and then sold property that belonged to her. Isn't that correct? I needed the money, Uncle Robert suddenly burst out, his composure finally cracking. I had debts, serious debts, and I thought she didn't care about the farm anyway. She never visited, never called to check on it. I thought I could sell it, pay what I owed, and nobody would get hurt. And where did these debts come from, Mr. Peterson? Uncle Robert's lawyer tried to object, but it was too late. Gambling, Uncle Robert said quietly. I owed money to some very dangerous people, and I was running out of time to pay them back. The courtroom was completely silent. Uncle Robert had just confessed to fraud in front of a judge, and everyone in the room knew it. His lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear, and I felt a mixture of vindication and sadness watching my uncle's complete breakdown. Judge Coleman called for a brief recess, and when we returned, she delivered her verdict with clear authority. Based on the evidence presented today, it is clear that Robert Peterson committed fraud by forging documents, lying to this court, and illegally claiming ownership of property that belonged to his niece. The quiet title action he obtained was based on false information and forged documents, and therefore it is null and void. She looked directly at Uncle Robert. Mr. Peterson, you have admitted under oath to committing fraud for personal financial gain. I am ordering that ownership of the farm property be immediately returned to Nicole Peterson, as specified in Henry Peterson's will. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the district attorney for possible criminal prosecution. I felt tears streaming down my face as the judge continued. Mr. Peterson, you are also ordered to make full restitution to the Bradley family, who purchased this property in good faith and now face financial hardship because of your criminal actions. You have 30 days to arrange payment, or your assets in Florida will be seized to satisfy this judgment. As we left the courthouse, I was surrounded by neighbors and friends offering their congratulations. Mrs. Henderson hugged me tightly and whispered, "Your grandfather would be so proud of you." Tom and Susan Bradley approached me with tears in their eyes. "Thank you for fighting for what was right," Susan said. "We know this wasn't easy for you." I meant what I said before. I told them, "If you want to buy the farm at a fair price, we can work something out. You've taken good care of it, and I think my grandfather would have liked you." 6 months later, I stood on the front porch of the farmhouse, watching Tom Bradley teach his son how to properly care for the chickens we'd decided to keep. Susan was inside, cooking dinner for all of us, a tradition we'd started when they decided to buy the farm from me at a price that allowed them to stay, and gave me enough money to honor my grandfather's legacy in a new way. I used part of the proceeds to establish a scholarship fund at the local high school for students interested in agriculture, something I knew my grandfather would have loved. The rest I invested, keeping enough aside to visit the farm regularly and maintain my connection to this place that had shaped who I was. Uncle Robert was sentenced to 2 years in prison for fraud and was ordered to pay full restitution to everyone affected by his crimes. I never spoke to him again, but I heard through Mrs. Henderson that he'd lost his condo in Florida and was working in the prison kitchen to pay off his legal fees. As I sat on that porch, watching the sunset paint the Iowa sky in shades of gold and red, I thought about everything I'd learned over the past year. I'd learned that family could betray you in the most unimaginable ways, but I'd also learned that communities could support you in ways you never expected. I'd learned that fighting for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Most importantly, I'd learned that my grandfather's legacy wasn't just about the land, it was about standing up for your principles, taking care of the people you love, and never giving up when something truly matters. The farm would always be part of who I was, but now I knew that I carried my family's strength with me wherever I went.